Now, we have considerable philosophical discussion relating to this issue, and it becomes more involved than we perhaps realize. Equilibrium is, to the average individual's concept, an idea of the suspension of motion. Actually, nature is moving toward equilibrium. But equilibrium is not something that is going to sneak up on us unaware. Equilibrium does not mean that someday, whether we will or not, the pendulum is going to stop in the middle. Equilibrium is the most difficult thing in nature to attain, because equilibrium is immortality. Equilibrium is a deathless state. It is a state in which excess ceases. All immoderations come to an end. And in the complete suspension of polarization, we attain what the Buddhist terms nirvana. For nirvana is the end of the imbalance of conflict in the compound personality of the human being. In the universe, equilibrium is also the end of conflict. But conflict cannot end until the conflicting factors have been resolved. And these conflicting factors are nothing more or less than the unfinishedness in things. Everything that is imperfect is unbalanced. And consequently, only perfection, which is a total equilibrium in the term of plus, can have complete equilibrium. Absolute negative equilibrium, or an equilibrium in the minus, is total negation. And total negation we cannot find either, although we find phases of negation which may nearly approach it in the purposeless, meaningless, ambitionless primitive, the human being whose desires are practically nil, whose wishes are comparatively few, and who therefore lives in what we term an ideal state of not wanting. He not only does not want, he has never learned to want. Man, in turn, must gradually want, outgrow wanting, and learn not to want. But there's a great deal of difference between never knowing and outgrowing. So motion is really through polarization to ultimate equilibrium. And we are reminded, of course, of the famous line in the Zohar, the unbalanced forces must perish in the void. Everything that is unbalanced must cease, must ultimately be dissolved in balance. Almost every negative emotion or negative attitude that we have is an unbalance. Therefore, hate is an unbalance. Fear is an unbalance. Anything which causes the individual to depart from his own center and become hopelessly involved in circumferential problems results in unbalance. Remember in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the soul of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Maat. If the scales balance, the soul may pass on into the blessed land. Therefore, balance, which is the great lesson of equilibrium, which in turn arises from man's experience of polarity. This procedure, through experience, brings man to one of the great discoveries, one of the great revelations, which sustain him and strengthen him for his spiritual adventure. Now, in the law of polarity, of course, we also have the laws which bring human beings together in various relationships: friendship, marriage, parent-children relationships. For nearly always these are subtly or factually polarized. We know in psychology that all relationships have to a measure a polar foundation. We know also man's natural desire as a human being to unite with the polar opposite, not only for purposes of the perpetuation of the species, but also for association, comfort, inspiration, and understanding. All these factors indicate man's sense of incompleteness, and emphasize the importance of polarity. Now, this again leads to one of the more profound philosophical observations on the subject, namely that polarity lies in the sphere of manifestation rather than in the sphere of substance. Things must physically or objectively appear polarized. But in their nature and substance, all things are in themselves in equilibrium. The spirit of man is forever in equilibrium. Therefore, the spirit of man must be and is an androgyne creature. The spirit of man must be and is an androgyne creature. It possesses within itself the capacity of polarization, but is not polarized except in manifestation. The particular and special polarization that we recognize being essentially physical. Thus, man, as a psychic or spiritual being, has an androgyne core, and in the effort to establish equilibrium in his objective life, he chooses marriage. He selects his mate and attempts in this way to balance his own nature. Both persons in the marriage being actually seeking to balance their own internal lives. Through association, the two individuals are partly restored to their natural androgen state. The man, through association with the woman, becoming more sensitive and having certain vital experiences which would not be possible to him alone in his polarized condition, and the woman vice versa. Therefore, in all instances, again, marriage is an effort to establish equilibrium, which in turn means harmonious organization or integration. And just as the moderation of the mind is necessary for creativity on a spiritual level, so the union or moderation of opposites on the physical level is necessary for the generation of the human being physically.
Marriage, folks, is therefore the hermetic symbol of the ultimate reunion of the two halves of each individual's nature, when, after repeated appearances and associations, equilibrium between these masculine and feminine qualities is established. Ultimately, the present methods of reproduction will be abolished, they say, and both halves of the spirit fire will again be turned into the brain. Hermetic anatomy teaches that there are two small bodies in the brain which are identified with the living yin and yang of China, or the positive and the negative, the male and the female. In the same way, every person has a masculine nature and a feminine nature, and never do we find these two entirely disassociated. It may be that East Indian philosophy gives us our best light on this rather perplexing subject, pun absolutely intended, for both the Hindus and the alchemists agree that the spirit, like God, is androgynous, being both father and mother. And, bear with me, it states in Genesis, quote, God created man in his own image, male and female created he them, end quote. So, while the creation is singular, within the creation there is two. And as the spirit of man is of God, it must partake of the androgynous nature of its parent,